Some mother-in-laws knit sweaters for their grandkids. Others, like Linda, create chaos. Today, I'll share a story about how my mother-in-law burned my son's belongings because she thought they were evil. This act led me to cut her off and send her a $10,000 legal bill. I'm 37, a black woman, married to Chris, a 42-year-old white man. We've been together for 10 years, married for 7. Chris is an amazing husband, but his mother, Linda, is a whole different story. From the beginning, Linda was a nightmare. She didn't outright say she had a problem with my race, but her passive-aggressive comments spoke volumes. She often made backhanded compliments about my hair or cooking and acted condescending when asking about my culture. I'll never forget the first time I met her. Chris took me home to meet his family, and Linda looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her reaction to me was, "When Chris told me about your background, I was expecting someone a little less dark. But you're quite beautiful, aren't you?" She chuckled as if it was a joke, but it was humiliating. As we sat and talked, she stared at me constantly. Finally, I asked her why. She smiled and said, "I was just wondering about your skincare routine. Your skin is so shiny. It must be so easy for you. Us white folks don't get that glow. We just look pale, don't we?" She laughed again, trying to cover her rudeness. Chris's dad, on the other hand, was wonderful. He was kind, respectful, and treated me with dignity. He made me feel welcome, unlike Linda, who constantly made me second-guess my relationship. When Chris proposed, my first question was, "What about Linda?" He reassured me, saying he'd handle her, even if it meant cutting her off for our happiness. Initially, Linda thought our relationship wouldn't last. But when Chris announced our engagement, she got furious. She couldn't openly object, so she tried to manipulate him by saying we were too different and that our future kids would have no real culture. She even tried setting him up with her friend's niece. Despite our engagement, Chris stood firm, and we got married with his dad's full support. Linda, however, was bitter throughout. She tried to overshadow me at the wedding and constantly picked fights with her husband for supporting us. After our wedding, Chris went low contact with Linda because I refused to let her treat me like a punching bag. His dad still visited us sometimes, but we never invited Linda, nor did we visit her. When I got pregnant, Linda reached out, begging to be part of our lives again. She claimed she wanted a fresh start and to be there for her grandchild. Chris thought we should give her a chance, and though I was skeptical, I agreed for the sake of peace. At first, Linda seemed to change. During my pregnancy, she was surprisingly kind, sending me flowers and buying my favorite snacks. Linda truly surprised me during my pregnancy. She went out of her way to organize a beautiful baby shower and acted like the perfect mother-in-law. She often expressed how happy she was that I was carrying the family's heir. For a moment, I thought she had changed. Then my son, Leo, was born. He's my little angel, with dark brown skin, just a couple of shades lighter than mine. The moment Linda saw him, her face dropped. She held him for less than a minute before passing him back to Chris, saying, "Well, at least he has your eyes." That should have been my first clue. Over the next few months, her behavior shifted. She stopped visiting and didn't seem interested in being the involved grandmother I had hoped for. In contrast, my father-in-law became a regular visitor. He loved taking Leo for strolls and even babysat him on occasion. When Chris confronted Linda about her absence, she claimed she didn't want to disturb me and wanted to give me alone time with the baby. But on the rare occasion she did visit, she spent her time reminiscing about Chris's childhood, emphasizing how white he had been as a baby. She made little digs about how much Leo resembled me and questioned our parenting style. She also hoped I was teaching Leo about their side of the family's heritage. I later found out she had been saying terrible things about Leo behind my back. She told relatives that he didn't even look like he belonged in the family and that she felt dirty after touching him. Another time, she mentioned to Chris's aunt that she was worried about how people would treat Leo because he looked too ethnic. When Chris found out, He was furious. He confronted her, and she swore she'd never say anything like that again. But the damage was done. A year ago, when my father-in-law passed away, Linda was going through a tough time. She apologized for her past behavior, saying she had no one left to call family. Feeling sorry for her, I allowed her back into our lives, but made it clear she wouldn't have a role in Leo's life unless she earned our trust. For the first few months, she visited frequently. When she came over, I would take Leo to his room or out of the house. Eventually, her visits decreased. Linda complained to Chris that it was humiliating to be sidelined from her grandson's life, so she decided to stay away. Chris sometimes visited her or took her out for lunch, which I didn't mind as long as she stayed out of my life. Everything seemed fine until last week. I was at work when I received a call from our babysitter, who said a woman claiming to be Leo's grandmother had shown up unannounced. Alarmed, I immediately video called to confirm it was Linda. I asked her why she was there, and she said she wanted to spend time with her grandson. I reluctantly agreed but felt uneasy. I kept monitoring the situation through the baby monitor, and at first, everything seemed fine. After Leo fell asleep, I refocused on my work, trying to shake off the unease. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was the babysitter, and her voice was frantic. "Linda's burning Leo's stuff," she exclaimed. I froze, unable to comprehend what I had just heard. She explained that after Leo fell asleep, Linda went into his room and later left with his belongings. The babysitter, who had dozed off briefly, woke up to a foul smell and saw smoke coming from the backyard. When she peered outside, she saw Linda burning Leo's toys, video games, and clothes. Horrified, she locked the door, called me, and kept a watchful eye on Leo. "I think she's a threat to Leo," the babysitter said, her voice trembling. My heart dropped, shaking with anger and disbelief. I told her to stay with Leo and not let him out of her sight. I immediately called Chris, who was closer to home, and asked him to rush there. Meanwhile, a neighbor had apparently called the cops after seeing Linda's bizarre behavior. When I arrived, smoke was still billowing from the backyard. Chris was outside, talking to the police. I ran straight to Leo's room to check on him. He was safe, eating snacks, and blissfully unaware of the chaos. The babysitter had done her best to keep him distracted, so he wouldn't notice his missing toys. Relieved that Leo was fine, I stormed outside. Linda stood there, unapologetic, as if she had done nothing wrong. I didn't care that the police were present. I demanded an explanation. Through sobs, Linda claimed she was cleansing the house. According to her, Leo's video games and toys were evil and corrupting his mind. She even criticized his clothes, calling them tacky and too colorful, insisting they weren't appropriate for a family of her heritage. I was livid. The police issued her a warning but didn't arrest her. I pleaded with them to book her for property destruction, but Chris convinced me to hold off and listen to him first. I recorded everything. The ashes in the fire pit, the smoke, and Linda's smug, self-righteous face as she justified her actions. I knew I wasn't going to let this slide. After the police left, Chris yelled at Linda, telling her she was no longer welcome in our home or our lives. He made it clear she had been spared jail time, but shouldn't expect forgiveness. Linda, however, was defiant. She started shouting again about how she was protecting Leo from bad influences. The argument grew ugly, and in the middle of it, we heard Leo crying from his room. We rushed inside and found him sitting on the floor, tears streaming down his face. He had realized his toys and clothes were gone and was in a full-blown panic. It was heartbreaking. At almost 4 years old, Leo wasn't a baby. He understood enough to feel the loss of his things. He kept asking us where his toys were and why his closet was empty. Explaining what had happened was one of the hardest things we'd ever had to do. To ease his distress, Chris and I took him shopping that same day. We bought him new clothes and a few toys, but it was impossible to replace everything. Linda had destroyed items worth an estimated $110,000, including custom-made toys and clothes. I was furious with Chris for not pressing charges. He tried to apologize on Linda's behalf, but I told him that wasn't enough. Linda needed to pay for what she had done, both literally and figuratively. Among the things Linda destroyed was a quilt that my late grandmother had lovingly made for Leo. Its loss was irreplaceable and deeply personal. Although Chris acknowledged the unforgivable nature of Linda's actions, he pleaded with me not to take legal action. She's a widow with no source of income, he argued. She's surviving on a pension and what savings my father left her. But I was firm. Being a widow doesn't excuse her actions, I replied. She crossed every imaginable line. She must face the consequences. Burning Leo's belongings wasn't just about destroying property. It was about violating our trust and the emotional toll it had taken on our family. Chris suggested he would cover the damages himself, insisting I didn't need to worry about replacing Leo's toys or clothes. But I wasn't swayed. It doesn't matter who pays, I said. It's our money in the end. What matters is that Linda takes responsibility for her actions. This disagreement caused tension between us, dragging on for a week. At times, I considered letting it go for the sake of peace. But every time Leo cried for his favorite toys and clothes, those precious things Linda had burned, I grew more furious. Finally, I decided to take action. I contacted a lawyer and had an official demand letter sent to Linda, seeking $10,000 in damages. The letter made it clear that if she didn't pay, we would take her to court, where she could face criminal charges for property destruction. I had evidence to back my claims. Videos of the fire, Linda's admissions, and even the police testimony. I was confident my case was strong. When Linda received the letter, she panicked. She called Chris, crying and begging him to make me drop the case. Chris told her it was out of his hands. Then she called me. Her tone wasn't remorseful. Instead, she tried to guilt-trip me. If your father-in-law were alive, he'd be heartbroken by the way you're treating me. He loved and respected you so much. Is this how you repay his kindness? I stayed calm. I reciprocated his love when he was alive. I said coldly, but you don't deserve any love or respect. I hung up before she could manipulate me further. My lawyer gave her 1 month to pay the damages. Linda tried every trick in the book to avoid paying. She roped in Chris's uncle to mediate, concocting wild stories to defend her actions. First, she claimed one of Leo's gadgets had caught fire on its own, sparking the blaze. When that lie fell apart, she argued that Leo was addicted to video games and she was simply disciplining him. I was livid. Who is she to discipline my child? I fumed. Even Chris's uncle, who knew Linda's true nature, pleaded with me to drop the charges for the sake of family peace. But I stood my ground. As the deadline approached, Linda started borrowing money from relatives to pay the $10,000. Some pitched in, but it wasn't even half the amount. When Chris found out, he felt guilty and sulked around the house. If you even think about helping her financially, I warned him, you'll be sleeping on the couch for a month. Chris didn't argue further. Chris eventually backed off from defending Linda and agreed not to intervene anymore. Linda, with no other options, sold a precious family heirloom, a piece of jewelry that had been in her family for generations, to pay the $10,000. When I heard about it, I didn't feel the slightest pang of guilt. After that, Linda became openly hostile. She told anyone who would listen that I had ruined her life and forced her to part with her cherished heirloom. Chris was bitter about the entire situation, constantly questioning if I had gone too far, given that Linda was a widow with no one to support her. But I stood firm. She traumatized Leo and destroyed his belongings, I said. Why should she get a free pass just because of her age or widowhood? Admittedly, the ordeal strained my marriage. Chris and I had long conversations where I laid out my feelings. I told him I would not tolerate disrespect or manipulation from Linda ever again. Chris admitted he was conflicted. He found Linda's behavior indefensible, but struggled with the fact that she was his mother and now alone after his father's death. I was clear. If you feel so bad for her, go see her. But she's banned from this house, and Leo is off limits. I mean it. Chris promised to keep Linda away from Leo, and for a while I believed him. The secret visits. 2 months after Linda had paid the damages, I noticed a change in Chris's behavior. He began leaving the house early on Saturday mornings, claiming he was going for drives or running errands. Chris is not a morning person, so this sudden routine shift piqued my suspicion. At first, I let it slide, but after it happened a few times, curiosity got the better of me. One Saturday, after Chris left, I packed Leo up and decided to follow him. I tailed him to Linda's apartment. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I waited until he came home later that afternoon. "So, how was your drive?" I asked casually. Chris looked me straight in the eye and said, "Good. Relaxing. Relaxing." The liar. I stayed calm and told him, "I know you've been meeting Linda." His face went pale. He stumbled over his words, trying to defend himself. "She's struggling emotionally and financially. I just wanted to make sure she's okay," he explained. I was shaken. His betrayal felt like a knife to the heart. I broke down. "You're choosing to comfort the woman who burned our son's belongings? She could have done far worse. What if the nanny hadn't been there? What if she hurt Leo?" Chris tried to justify his actions, but I wasn't having it. "If you want to keep seeing Linda," I said, "then you need to decide. It's either her or us." That was his choice, but I made it clear he'd better not bring the energy back into our home. Things got ugly between us, to say the least. By the end of it, Chris reluctantly agreed to stop seeing Linda for the sake of our marriage. But the damage was already done. I couldn't shake the feeling that, deep down, he was still prioritizing her over us. A week later, Linda found a new way to interfere. She sent a letter addressed to Leo. She must have known I'd never allow her near him, so this was her latest tactic. The letter dripped with passive-aggressive comments disguised as affection. She wrote things like, "Grandma misses you so much, but unfortunately, Mommy doesn't want us to see each other. I hope you're being a good boy and remembering the values I tried to teach you, even if Mommy doesn't understand them." When I showed Chris the letter, he argued that it was harmless. "She's just trying to maintain a connection," he said. I didn't buy it. I ripped up the letter in front of him and threw it in the trash without letting Leo see it. I told Chris that if Linda sent another letter, I'd get a restraining order. Linda wasn't finished. She escalated by involving other members of Chris's family. One day, Chris's uncle called me. He's a kind man, much like my late father-in-law, which is why I even answered. But the moment he said he wanted to talk about Linda, I felt my patience wearing thin. "What about hers?" I asked. He sighed and began. "Linda's been heartbroken about being cut off from Leo. I know she's made mistakes. But don't you think it's time to move on, for the sake of the family?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "With all due respect, this has nothing to do with the family," I said firmly. "This is about Linda's refusal to take accountability for her actions. She burned my child's belongings and traumatized him. Do you honestly think I'm just going to forget that because she's heartbroken?" He tried to argue that Linda had suffered enough and that cutting her off was only making things worse. I ended the call before I said something I'd regret. At this point, my relationship with Chris was strained. We weren't outright fighting, but the tension between us was undeniable. I knew we couldn't keep going like this, so I suggested couples therapy. Chris was reluctant. "Why do we need therapy?" "We're fine," he said. "We're not fine," I replied bluntly. "We can barely talk about your mother without arguing. This is about more than just Linda. It's about how we handle conflict as a team. If we don't address it now, it's only going to get worse." He finally agreed, and we began therapy. It turned out to be one of the best decisions we'd ever made. In therapy, Chris admitted he felt torn between me and Linda. He understood why I was angry but struggled to completely sever ties with his mother, especially now that she was alone. The therapist helped us work through our feelings and set boundaries. Chris agreed to stop all contact with Linda unless she showed genuine remorse and took responsibility for her actions. I agreed to be open to the possibility of reconciliation in the distant future, but only if Linda made a sincere effort to repair the damage she had caused. It's been 3 months since we started therapy, and things are finally beginning to improve. Chris hasn't seen or spoken to Linda in months, and our relationship is stronger because of it. As for Linda, she hasn't reached out to us since the letter to Leo. I've heard through relatives that she's still bitter about selling her heirloom and blames me for her financial struggles. Honestly, I couldn't care less. My son is thriving. He no longer asks about the burnt items, and his happiness is all that matters. I'm not naive. I know Linda will probably try to worm her way back into our lives at some point. But for now, I'm enjoying the peace we've fought so hard to achieve. For the first time in a long time, it feels like we're moving forward.